I'm Christina Cauterucci, and this season on Slow Burn.
It's called Proposition 6.
The Briggs Initiative.
John Briggs is going to fire every gay and lesbian school teacher in California.
With so much at stake, young people became activists.
We can't let this happen in California.
And activists became leaders.
My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you.
Slow Burn, Season 9, Gays Against Briggs. Out now, wherever you listen.
So, where I'd like to start is that we are sort of in the midst of another kind of round of moral panic about marriage.
We live in an era of the collapse of marriage in our society.
Declining marriage rates and opinion pieces.
People get married on average like 10 years later now than they did.
It's destroying the country.
That's right.
And all of Western civilization. It really is.
New books on the market.
Much discussed book, Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization.
All making the case that marriage will make you happier, richer, healthier, and certainly will produce better, more well-off children. Am I missing anything?
No, I think you've got it all in the specifics. I think the broader message that comes through, and it's really been like 6 or 8 months of just a steady drumbeat, is that marriage is this magic elixir that's the solution to all kinds of massive, gaping problems.
I'm Julie Kohler, and this is White Picket Fence. I've been watching with interest as this moral panic about marriage has taken hold. Maybe you've noticed it too. Pundits and politicians have become awfully concerned that people are marrying later and less often, that a growing number of adults are living alone without a spouse or partner, that divorce remains relatively common, that many women, myself included, are having and raising kids as single mothers. Conservatives waxing poetic about family values is hardly new. But this is more than just hand-wringing with a microphone. These folks are actually doing something about it. This season, we're exploring the return of the marriage panic. Why so many people are getting so whipped up over the way that Americans are, or are not, forming relationships and building families. Why marriage is becoming, once again, the catch-all policy solution for all of our country's challenges. We'll go beyond the rosy sheen of love and commitment and expose the darker side of all this marriage talk, one that we absolutely should pay attention to.
The project of reinstating marriage as a compulsory norm is a project that is inextricably tied to leaving women dependent on that institution and on marriage.
That's Rebecca Traister. Rebecca is a senior writer for New York Magazine and The Cut, and a friend of the show. She's written a lot about changing marriage patterns in America through a feminist lens, including her 2016 book, All the Single Ladies. And she was one of the first writers to publicly flag the emerging marriage panic, what she called the marriage plot, in a column that she wrote last year.
Our patterns around marriage are inextricably interwoven with sort of social and political movements and progress and regress.
What Rebecca argues is that these marriage promoters aren't just prescribing marriage as a balm for what ails us, a solution for the social isolation and loneliness that have become all too common in our post-pandemic digital age. Rather, she says we're witnessing a full-throated campaign to make straight marriage ubiquitous again. Why? Well, there are a number of reasons, which we'll get into. But at the root of this panic are a set of facts, namely that marriage patterns have changed dramatically since the 1950s. And those changes in marriage patterns have gone hand in hand with other cultural shifts.
The peak of early hetero married life, especially for white middle-class Americans, was the 1950s, 1960s. That it was entirely government engineered, right? The government actually poured in that period of decades an incredible amount of money into creating conditions that would encourage and stabilize a white middle class and incentivize an early hetero marriage model. And in fact, in that period, people were marrying at the youngest ages that we have recorded and at the highest rates. For a long time in this country, being hetero married was the kind of it was the validation of you were an adult. And it was, if you wanted to have a sex life, if you wanted to have children, it had to be done under the umbrella of marriage. That has changed for a lot of reasons. There were a lot of social movements, the legalization of contraception, abortion, increasingly liberal divorce laws, the sexual revolution, the invention of the pill. There are a million different factors that went into the way our marriage patterns have changed. And marriage is now far more optional than it was.
And a lot of people, myself and Rebecca included, think that's a very good thing.
You no longer need to get married if you want to have a sex life, if you want to have a family. And that means that you do not need to get married at the beginning of your adulthood. People are doing things very differently now. They are certainly cohabiting in many cases. They are getting married later in life. They are divorcing with more ease. They are having children outside of marriage. They are living in groups in different ways. They are marrying multiple times or never at all, but having long-term partnerships. There are a million different paths that millions of people can now take.
But, of course, not everyone agrees that this is such a good thing. In fact, there seems to be a growing cottage industry of mostly men who opine about how these changes, people marrying later, people marrying less, women having fewer children, are bad. How they constitute the breakdown of the family and represent the erosion of institutions that orient us toward the common good. These claims are debatable, but they're often accepted at face value. As I watched this latest wave hit the headlines, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. Because when it comes to marriage panics, I've actually got a lot of experience. And not just because I'm a single mom. I have a PhD in family science. It's a field where we study relationships and families and research things like marriage, child-rearing, divorce. And back in the 90s, when I was getting my degree, talk about marriage was everywhere. Open up the Atlantic, and you'd see think pieces defending Vice President Dan Quayle for taking a fictional television character to task, in campaign speeches for having a child as a single mother.
It doesn't help matters when primetime TV has Murphy Brown, a character who supposedly epitomizes today's intelligent, highly paid professional woman, mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone and calling it just another lifestyle choice.
Turn on the television, and you'd see politicians, Republicans and Democrats alike, freaking out about the prospect of queer couples getting married. States raced to amend their constitutions to ban same-sex marriage. Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act into law, which legally defined marriage as a union between a man and a woman. By the time I'd graduated in the early aughts, George W. Bush was expanding on Bill Clinton's welfare reform by establishing the Healthy Marriage Initiative. It encouraged low-income mothers to marry, assuming that if they found a man, they wouldn't need government support. And then there was this emerging movement for something called covenant marriage, essentially a two-tier system that made marriage harder to get into and harder to get out of. It required marriage counseling and restricted the grounds for divorce. At one point, more than 20 states were proposing it, including Minnesota, where I was living. I was so fascinated by this phenomenon that I wrote my dissertation on it. Over the last 2 decades, a lot of that marriage fervor faded. The marriage equality movement sparked a cultural and legal transformation that made marriage a more inclusive institution. more and more states legalized same-sex marriage. And in 2015, the Supreme Court made marriage equality the law of the land. The Healthy Marriage Initiative morphed into the Healthy Relationships Initiative. And covenant marriage became kind of irrelevant. It only passed in 3 states, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Arizona. And within those states, fewer than 1% of all married couples chose a covenant marriage. Most people just got married the normal way. For years, I joked that I was the leading expert on the most politically obscure and least relevant topic in the world. Until last fall, when covenant marriage returned to the headlines. A little-known congressman from Louisiana, best known for his socially conservative views and the fact that he and his wife had a covenant marriage, suddenly became Speaker of the House. And in the wake of new Speaker Mike Johnson's kind of unusual reference to his wife in his first floor speech after assuming the gavel.
She spent the last couple of weeks on her knees in prayer to the Lord, and she's a little worn out.
There was a flurry of news coverage of the Johnsons and their covenant marriage. Now look, Mike Johnson accepted, not many people are talking about covenant marriage these days. But Johnson's rise to political prominence felt somehow symbolic in a moment in which marriage, once again, is being framed as
total panacea to fix what are, in fact, massive gaping problems, right? That are only getting worse in this country. It's being presented as the fix to real struggles that millions of people are facing.
Rebecca Traister again.
It is one of the most pernicious habits we have in this country of, instead of addressing systemic inequalities with potential systemic solutions, government policies, we instead tell people that it's their individual behaviors or failure to conform to certain kinds of behavioral expectations that has caused the problems that they're having. And that if they just pulled up their pants or got married, that their poverty or loneliness or depression or fear would be alleviated. And that's just not true.
The goal of each one of these moral panics, in the 90s and today, is to keep us focused on our personal failings, our deservingness or lack thereof, to distract us from all of the larger reasons that life can be challenging, all the inequities. And it's probably no coincidence who's being held up as the model. As the folks who are doing it right, who are continuing to get married and stay married at higher rates.
It's white, upper middle class people are the people who are most likely to get married right now.
And so what many of these conservatives are calling for is essentially a marketing strategy. Teach young people the right steps to take in life, in the right order, and poof, everything will be solved. You too can live the life of an upper middle class white family. They even have a name for this magic formula, the success sequence.
So here are the 3 rules. You want to be rich in America? You want to do well in America? Number 1, you need to finish high school. Number 2, you need to get married before you have babies. Number 3, you need to get a job. That's it. You do those things, you will not be permanently poor in the United States of America.
But many of these marriage promoters aren't stopping there. And that's because today's marriage panic coincides with some broader shifts, namely the rise of white Christian nationalism within the Republican Party. And for those folks, the marriage panic is not about getting more people married. It's part of a larger strategy to reverse all the ways that women can live independent, stable lives outside of marriage.
I think there's no question that this is tied to a desire to put women back in a box of economic, social, and sexual dependence. And you can see that because it's the very conservative forces that are doing things like trying, for example, to make divorce harder to get, to roll back no-fault divorce laws. And of course, this is all happening at the same time that the Dobbs decision, there had been obviously tremendous erosion and rollback of access to abortion over decades prior to the Dobbs decision. And now, abortion bans in more states every day, actually. We're speaking just after Florida upheld its 6-week abortion ban. Really draconian laws being put into place to limit people's ability to get the reproductive health care they need. And also the fight to ban medication abortion, which was just heard by the Supreme Court, and the sort of return to the Comstock laws, which would bar certain kinds of contraception. All of this is about rolling back the legal and medical innovations that made it more possible for women to live independently of this institution on which they had long been dependent, which was marriage.
And there are signs that we, as a nation, are making marriage less compulsory. In the wake of the pandemic, the Biden administration made historical investments in childcare, paid sick leave, and expanded child tax credit, all of which had the collective impact of supporting families economically and leaving women less dependent on marriage as the sole way of supporting their children. But as we've talked about on earlier seasons of this podcast, a lot of these benefits were time-limited. They've since expired. But their success and the prospect of their return still makes conservatives nervous. So they want to refocus the conversation on marriage.
Certainly, a lot of what we've seen in the past 4 years, because this is where Biden has actually been good, are exactly some of the economic policies, most of which are now off the table, but that would better support a world in which marriage was not the only organizing structure. So,
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. God forbid, women can exist outside of marriage. So
right.
you gotta
Exactly.
Snap it back.
Yep.
It's important to recognize that it's conservatives driving the marriage panic. But it's also important to recognize who's going along with it. And one of the other parallels between now and the 90s is that a pretty conservative agenda is being echoed by a whole variety of elite, supposedly centrist thought leaders with big platforms, like a bunch of op-ed writers at the New York Times.
The kind of hushed, no one will say this out loud. But we
Oh.
have to. But, I'm going to be really brave and name it. We have to do a little both and here. And conservatives have some points that family structure matters. Because again, I think the backlash story is more clear on sort of the why now moment with the conservative resurgence. But why are we seeing this resurgence within this kind of, centrist normcore crowd is what I would call it.
Well, in part because centrist normcore is very receptive to conservative messages, right? All kinds of purportedly liberal institutions are actually fundamentally conservative and in many cases run by elites. I mean, there are a couple really funny aspects of this current wave that you're describing that is just all over. The New York Times should devote an entire section to marriage propaganda because it constantly and so a couple of the things that I always look for is no one will say this out loud. Okay, no, they literally say it out loud in the New York Times.
All the time.
Every week, sometimes 4 or 5 times a week. It is said out loud all the time. Also, so much of our pop culture is built around it. Go to a movie theater, watch a television show. We have billions of dollars in this country invested in telling people that the pinnacle experience of their lives is falling in love and getting married. Okay, that is this is not a quiet part. This is not a secret. This is not it is our everyday. We swim in it.
We've seen it across 28 seasons of The Bachelor, which actually debuted in 2002, right at the height of the last marriage panic.
Now, what also happens in that period as the marriage ages really start to rise is that you see an investment of the wedding industry. Say Yes to the Dress, The Bachelor, the wedding magazines, the Your Special Day crap, right? All of that stuff starts building in the period in which people, A, start marrying less early and less frequently, and B, as long as marriage isn't compulsory and it is more likely to be entered into by people who feel like they're in a stable position to enter into it, they're going to have more money and more resources to spend on their giant weddings. And so a lot of the cultural things we're seeing, they're inextricable from like regress and backlash attitudes, but they're also inextricable from from just capitalism and an industry that was building and that saw potential for a lot of money.
But there's another reason that marriage panics tend to have such a strong hold over us. We're told that science proves that we're better off married. Welcome to Intro to Statistics. Today, we're going to talk about the difference between causation and correlation. Causation means action A causes outcome B. Correlation means there's simply a relationship between the two events. Why are we talking about this? Because we're faced with people that claim marriage, action A, causes outcome B. Happiness, healthiness, and wealth. But that's like saying ice cream causes people to buy sunscreen. Marriage does not take unhappy, unhealthy people and make them the opposite.
There was this study about happiness that made the connection that a decline in happiness has coincided with a decline in sort of compulsory marriage. And so a lot of people have taken that to say, okay, so the key to being happy or happier is to be married. But in fact, one of the things that the studies of all those married people who appear to be happier suggests is that people who are married are doing so because the circumstances of falling in love with or wanting to partner with somebody makes them really happy. And they're not just doing it because they're pregnant and young and their community or their religious group mandates that they get married. They're not just getting married because they don't have the opportunity to earn a living, and so they have to hook themselves legally to somebody who does have that opportunity. And they're doing it because they want to marry another specific person whom they enjoy spending time with.
And that's what's a bit crazy about this moment. We have people who are looking at the positive effects of marriage becoming less compulsory and arguing that it justifies making marriage more compulsory. As though just pushing any people together, getting unmarried people to just get married to anyone, will have the same benefits as organically meeting someone, falling in love, and choosing to get married because it's something you mutually want to do. As a grad student 20 years ago, I was concerned about the agenda to make marriage more compulsory. But today, my stakes in the issue are different. I now come to it as a single mom of a 9-year-old son. And while the marriage promoters usually include some kind of aside that says, single mothers aren't bad exactly, and yeah, we'll probably always have some of them around, I worry about the implications for my family. I worry about my kid growing up in a world that believes that married two-parent families with a mom and a dad are best, and that our family's not. I'm not being sensitive. One study found that in just 4 years, we've seen a 7% increase in Americans who believe that single mothers are bad for society. It's a belief that has deep roots.
It is embedded deeply in our history, beginning with colonization.
When the earliest European settlers landed on the continent, they wanted to conquer what they saw as the wilderness. The way to do that was to impose hierarchies and order.
And that order began with family units. So that in the New England colonies, for example, there were local laws that said that everybody in the community needed to be attached to a family unit headed by a landowning man, and that single people would be a source of community disorder and chaos, right? That they were these sort of loose atoms who were going to cause chaos.
Many of us had thought that we had evolved beyond that view of single people, single women, as chaos agents, as disruptors of the hierarchies that bring order and stability to society. But if you listen to what they're saying in white Christian nationalist circles right now, it sounds eerily familiar.
The individual building block of society, according to the Word of God, is not atomistic individuals. It is the molecule, not the atom, but the molecule of the family.
Yeah.
The family unit should not be separated. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder.
Will women have the right to vote tomorrow if you wave that magic Christian wand?
No.
Okay.
The bottom line is that I think we are deluding ourselves if we don't take the marriage panic seriously or view it as a real threat to our freedoms and to building the kind of society that recognizes the dignity of all people. This season on White Picket Fence.
Being enslaved means you don't own your own body. Marriages of enslaved people were not legalized.
For a lot of groups, it's been the primary vehicle for awarding rights, particularly for women.
Anybody can tell you in America it's easier for a 16-year-old to get married than it is for a 46-year-old to get a divorce.
You can't just abracadabra your way through marriage to basically decrease inequality.
Everything that is inside of us is longing for and trying to move toward each other.
This marriage movement that we're seeing today believes that they are the ones who should get to tell everyone else who they are and what they desire.
White Picket Fence is a Wonder Media Network production. Our producers are Maddie Foley, Carmen Borca Carrillo, Abby Delk, and Lauren Williams. Our editor is Lindsay Cradwell. Executive producer is Jenny Kaplan. Original music by Sean Patel. Special thanks to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Shared Ascent Fund for their generous support for this season.